Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well. In this video, I would like to return to the question of MBTI and particularly INFJness. There's this question, and it's a question that tends to appear a lot in the conversations that people have about INFJs. Sometimes it's themselves, sometimes they're not sure whether it is what they are. And what I'm going to talk about in this video is basically ways to figure out whether you are INFJ or not outside of the tests that are provided online. You will hear that the tests are unreliable. We all know that, so I'm not going to cover this particular topic. I'll just leave it aside as something that we have agreed upon. If you get INFJ with an online test, this does not mean that you're an INFJ, just in the same way that if you get something else than INFJ in an online test, this does not mean that you are not INFJ. So a lot of the time what you hear is that to figure out whether you are an INFJ, you need to look at the functions. So this is obviously a recommendation that I would have for anyone who identifies as INFJ but is not particularly convinced or certain yet that they are INFJ, because what I know is that INFJs tend to be among the people, and let me know guys if you agree with this, they tend to be among the people who are the most likely to keep questioning their type, and they will not easily be satisfied that they are certain that they are this type, okay? And so maybe this could be a way for you guys to just settle on it finally, right? Because INFJs question all the time. They question all the time. And this is a product of being an I dominant and not using TE, I think. But in any case, you want to study the functions, sure. But for those who are either not familiar with the functions, and for those also that maybe are a little bit familiar with the functions, but they're not quite sure about how to go about them, exactly what they mean, right? Maybe I can give some tips, or at least I can give you a perspective that for my part has really helped me to identify my type for sure, okay? So when you look at the function stack, it's NI, FETI, SE, introverted intuition, extroverted feeling, introverted thinking, and extroverted sensing. So that's the archetype, okay? But you have to keep in mind that you have function tests online, and you can take some of those functions tests, but they will have the same problems. They have the exact same issue that the other tests have. So you can have certain tests that are more or less reliable about the dichotomies. You can have certain functions tests that are reliable, but the confirmation bias, answering what you wish you were rather than what you really are, answering what your opinion about something rather than what you would really do yourself, that's also going to crop up in the functions test. So the functions tests are useful, but again, not the ideal. When you study your type and you study the functions, you want to look really carefully into the definition of introverted intuition, NI. I made videos on introverted intuition on my channel, so if you just search for introverted intuition, or if you just browse through my channel, you can check a video called Introverted Intuition in Action. I'll link it below in this video so that you can get a sense of how I relate to my own introverted intuition, to see if you relate to it. So research introverted intuition, see if it feels familiar to you, okay? And the thing is, I know for a fact that it's not easy to understand introverted intuition. It's a very abstract definition because almost by nature, introverted intuition is hard to talk about. It's so abstract and so symbolic and so non-verbal in many ways that once it gets translated into the verbal domain, what you will read, which will be your resources, sometimes will make it hard for you at first to distinguish, say, between NE and NI, right? So perhaps you will have a difficulty distinguishing between NE and NI. I'm not going to go into the detail of the functions now, but that's fine, But what's interesting is that if you're hesitating between NE and NI, at least you know that you're very high on N. So you can cast aside the sensor types, right? You're high on N. So that's already something interesting, because it might suggest that you're a dominant perceiver. And if that suggests that you're a dominant perceiver, you already sort of know that you're either ENTP, ENFP, INTJ, or INFJ. Okay, so that's like a very important thing to figure out. You know, focus on NI, and even if you struggle a bit to distinguish between NI and NE, see if you think N is the most dominant function in your stack, because the difference between an N dominant and an N auxiliary is at least as important as the difference between a P and a J, you know, if not more. It's probably more, because at least the difference is in terms of functions, which are related back to Jung's theory, whereas the P and J are related to how you manifest your extroverted functions, which is, I mean, sure, it has value, but I think the function stack is more interesting. Now, the dominant function is very important because it really is what needs to be your main function. That is, you cannot be an INFJ if you're not an NI dominant. You cannot be an INTP if you're not a TI dominant. So that's why it's very important. But this is important to figure out as well, is that does not mean that your function stack is going to be the exact same as the archetype, right? If you feel, for example, that you're an NI dominant, but like you're unusually high on FI, or on TE, or that your TI is not particularly high up and you think that your SE is higher, or if you feel like your FE could be higher, that does not mean that you are not an INFJ, okay? If you felt that you were not strong on NI, that would mean that you're not INFJ. But if you are confident that you are strong on NI, the other functions, they're not, if you like, they're not the lens through which you see the world. They're not the lens through which you see the world. So it's possible to repress, to some extent, FE, to have underdeveloped TI, to have slightly overdeveloped SE. I know INFJs online who have quite well developed SE. You know, it's a pattern, if you like. You should never think in terms of I must fit the archetype. It's a pattern. So you look at your function stack, you analyze your different patterns of function use in the way in which you see it qualitatively. You look at each function and you think, okay, I use this one, I use that one. You can take tests to sort of point you towards a resolution. And then you compare the pattern of your function use, and you look at the, archetypes of the MBTI types, and you match it against the one that looks like it the most, right? So if you have a functional stack that looks the most like the INFJ, it means that you tend towards INFJ, so you basically can say, I identify as an INFJ. And you notice that this preserves the possibility for difference within INFJs, and therefore this allows us to have an answer to people who argue that MBTI puts people in boxes. Because if you reason in terms of tending towards a type, having a function stack that matches best that particular function stack of that particular type, then that actually makes room for diversity, for an infinite amount of diversity. So keep that in mind. Now, in your 4 functions that you think you use the most, NI needs to be dominant and FE needs to be strong enough. All right. If your FE is number 4 or below that, number 5 or 7, you're not going to be an INFJ. But if it's third, maybe you repress it a bit, right? Now, of course, if it's third and FI is second, much more likely to be an INTJ. But look at the TE as well. That's why you need to sort of look at the different patterns. It's impossible to match a type perfectly. So never think in terms of there is this function stack and I must see whether I completely identify with it, because it's a pattern. Now, it suggests ways to grow If you're an INFJ, you probably have the potential to develop TI quite well, but maybe for a bunch of reasons you didn't get to develop it that well. I know INFJs who have rather undeveloped TI, and they are undoubtedly NIFE people. Basically, the higher the function in the archetypal stack, the higher the function in the archetypal stack, the higher the most likely it has to be high placed in your stack. The lower it is in the archetypal stack, from tertiary and inferior especially, the more permissible it is for it to be lower in your own function stack. So for example, your dominant needs to be the dominant archetypal function, NI. Your FE needs to be in your top 3, right? TI, honestly, again, I've met INFJs who have TI that's like a TI that's quite undeveloped. Like it might rank at number 6. And the thing is, you might think, well, maybe then they're not INFJs. Well, I can assure you that I asked myself that question, and they were clearly NIF users, just happened to have underdeveloped TI. It's more likely to have undeveloped TI than it is to have undeveloped FE, particularly if you're a young INFJ. So it doesn't mean that you're not. It just means that you can work on it. You have a potential for it, okay? So always think in terms of patterns. Now, just to conclude this video, some very practical advice. A lot of INFJs wonder if they are INFPs. Okay, well, there's a very simple, well, no, it's not a very simple solution, but there is a solution, I think, to identify whether you are an INFP or an INFJ. Just look into FI and look at whether you resonate more with introverted feeling versus extroverted feeling. This is assuming that NI and NE, you have a bit of trouble differentiating, and I understand why that could be the case. But the thing is, an INFJ can be relatively okay with FI, but will never be a dominant FI. Like it's by definition impossible. Even FI cannot be the auxiliary of an INFJ. So if you look into FI carefully and you look into FE, even if you're not super developed for FE, even if you're a little bit underdeveloped, it will still always be higher than it will be for FI, okay? And in that way, you will just figure out. So if you like, instead of reasoning in terms of am I an INFJ or am I an INFP, assume that you're an INFJ, or rather assume that you're an INFP, and assume that you're an FI Dom, if you like, and see if that makes sense for your life. If it doesn't make sense for your life, then you can just cast out an INFP. The INFP type might look like the INFJ type, but they are extremely different types. And the dominant FI of an INFP is completely different than the FE auxiliary of an INFJ. And in fact, the TI of the INFJ, if it's well developed, will allow you to basically identify for sure that you're neither INFP nor ENFP, okay? Because ENFPs and INFPs, they do not have strong TI. Occasionally they can manipulate it well, but like they're going to have some TE there. But if you use TI, then you're not an INFP and an ENFP. And if these were the only types that you wonder you might be instead of INFJ, well, then you've sorted it. If you have strong TI and you're wondering about whether you're an INTP, see if you could be a TI Dom. INTPs, they live through TI. It's their lens, the way that NI is for us. So to be a dominant TI is something very different than to be a tertiary TI. So again, try to imagine that. But if you feel like you're neither an FI dominant, because this doesn't really resonate with you, if you feel like you're certainly not a TI dominant, because this doesn't really resonate with you, but you are you're strong on your N, right? You're strong on your N, and FE speaks to you more than FI speaks to you. I mean, you're going to be an INFJ. So again, think in terms of functional patterns and like look at TI, look at FI, and look at FE. If you happen to have difficulties with understanding NI, NE, and their differences. I have videos for FE versus FI. I have videos on NI, and I will soon make a video on TI for an INFJ and how I perceive TI as being manifested, even among the INFJs that are not very proficient, because even if TI is not very proficient to function for them, it is still in a sense functionally they're tertiary, so they're going to relate to it in a way that will have similarities with the usage of other INFJs, okay? So I'll make a video on TI tertiary for INFJs and how I perceive it in my own life for you guys to help you further identify whether you think you are INFJ or another type. Okay, that's all for the video. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care.